Hi everyone, welcome back to another session at ICWSM, and I'm really happy to say that we're continuing kind of our excellent stream of panels this year. And this year we're going to be, for this panel in particular, we're kind of exploring a really interesting topic of kind of the global nature of research and global nature of research with a focus on ICWSM. And as such, we've kind of pulled together a set of amazing panelists, once again, continuing the trend that we've had so far. But the key thing about the panel and what we're trying to really get to is the fact that ICWSM is kind of a diverse community, it's an international community, and it's an inclusive community. But it's really important to not just say that, but actually act that, be that. And one of the key things we're trying to do with this panel is really to kind of emphasize this and to, critically reflect on what we've been doing in the past with respect to these topics, but also kind of chart a path forward. And with that in mind, we have some kind of ICWSM experts, people that are kind of some old hands, as we like to call them in the UK. So people that are very familiar with the conference. And we also have some people that are not so familiar, but have a breadth of experience on exactly these areas and maybe can help us maybe inform what ICWSM does for the next 15 years of the conference. So without further ado, I just want to introduce the panelists, and then I'll kind of pivot back one sec. So without further ado, we have Professor Anisha Peters from the University of Namibia. So Anisha, please, happy to have you here. Welcome. We have Dr. Francisco.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Dr. Francisco Marmolejo from the University of Oxford. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have Professor Brooke Foucault-Wells from Northeastern University. Hey, welcome, Brooke. And we have Dr. Kokil Jedka from National University of Singapore. Hey.
Hey.
Hey, right. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for once again joining today's panel. And we have kind of a packed schedule of things to discuss. But one of the things I want to highlight as we kind of start off and kick off today's panel is what we've been looking at so far as it relates to DEI in ICWSM. And in preparing to this year's conference, we have the opportunity to actually kind of pause and to reflect on what we've been doing so far and how far we've come. We've had a chance to kind of reflect on what we've done in terms of the international outreach of the conference. And we found a number of interesting things, some things that clearly highlight some room for improvement, but some also things that are quite positive. Like for example, we found things like, of course, probably because of its roots, ICWSM has a kind of a very strong North American presence, but we can actually see small offshoots still growing quite well actually in places like South America and places in Asia. But there's really a kind of a question here around how do we kind of boost involvement, especially in places like certain parts of Asia, like South America, like Africa, and so on. So these are the kind of things that we kind of noticed as we were kind of reflecting over attendance numbers for the last few years, author numbers, publication numbers, our research and our efforts towards accessibility. So all these are things that are key points that really kind of resonated with us. So, I mean, to start things off, it would really be great if we can have maybe the panelists introduce themselves and maybe talk a little bit about maybe their work in the area of inclusivity, of global equity, and so on. I'll start with you, Anisha.
Oh, wow. Is that because my name starts with an A? Nonetheless.
Definitely.
Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and good afternoon, all participants who's attending. As said, I'm Anisha Peters, and I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Research, Innovation and Development at the University of Namibia. University of Namibia is a public university in Namibia, the largest one, and we have about 32,000 students and 12 campuses spread across, our country is quite big, so spread across the country. I hail from Namibia, and my specialization is human-computer interaction. I'm also a former Dean of Computing and Informatics at our sister university in Namibia, so I made a shift to the other one. And my research fields is social media, e-participation, such as digital health, gender, e-government, all of the sort of E's I also do research in gamification. So my interest, particularly in global equity, diversity and inclusion, led me to establish the AFRICAI conference and community, that's the Africa Human-Computer Interaction, because I also challenged the status quo, just like you do, Jason. I was looking at CHI and the participation of Africans. And usually when the attendees, participants, the map of the world would come up and you see where people were, it's like there were no lights going up for Africa. And so I challenged that status quo and we started it since 2010, but we only had our first conference 2016. But it's going on. We have like a biannual conference. I'm also the founder of 3 ACM chapters in Namibia, one of which is a SICAI chapter. And I'm co-founder of 2 more ACM chapters in the United States and various student organizations actually in the US, but that was some years back. And then furthermore, I'm sort of also with sort of equity and diversity. I'm also a co-founder of the GenderMag method, which finds gender inclusiveness issues within software design and development. We've extended it to also include minorities and not only women. Now, there's a lot of other activities that I work on and how we're trying to get Africans into the space, but I think that we'll have some time that we can talk about it later. Maybe just one interesting thing is together with a co-PI from Egypt, we got a Google Research Award for Inclusion Research last year, and we're doing research on human-centered AI for social justice. Awesome, thank you.
That was perfect, Anisha, and there's so many interesting things there to pick up on, which I'm sure we'll get to explore further. I mean, even starting at AFRICAI and kind of being there for that as it developed and it grew and pushing that. I mean, that's kind of, you said you're the perfect person to be on this panel. So very, very, very welcome. At this point in time, I'll jump to Francisco. Please introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your work in this space.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me in the panel. I'm currently a career development fellow in computer science at the University of Oxford. I'll be transitioning to Harvard University as a postdoctoral fellow. My work is mostly in algorithmic game theory. I work on incentives, on the complexity of different game theoretic concepts. So from a theory perspective originally, but now much more in practice. I work on aspects of blockchain technology, and I'm also an organizer for a research initiative called Mechanism Design for Social Good, which is an interdisciplinary research group with researchers from all over the world that seeks to improve access to opportunity. And I began working with MD4SG 3-4 years back. And my true experience with diversity and outreach, especially at the international scale, began really with organizing the flagship workshop for MD4SG last year, in which I was one of the program chairs for the workshop. And I'm originally from Mexico, but much as Anisha was telling us about bringing in participation from different regions around the world, I noticed that in the past, in many of these conferences, that the lights in the Latin America region were also characteristically dim. And so inspired by some of the work that had been done in MD4SG and in different chapters around the world, I tried to push for more inclusivity from the Latin American region with many actually of the characteristics that ICWSM has pushed in this very year. So I'm looking forward to kind of talk about this a little bit more over the course of the panel. But my focus has been on the Latin American region and trying to bridge that community into our computer science research groups.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, and there's clearly a lot of overlap there, especially with what Anisha was speaking about. And I think one thing once again, a massive thank you, because when we were initially creating and reflecting on the work that ICWSM has done over the last few years, I got connected to Francisco and I basically pinged him. I tried to understand what work has been done in the space, and he was very, very kind actually to share the work that they have done in kind of critically reflecting on things like inclusivity, things like diversity in the MD4SG community. And we kind of use a number of those ideas to actually craft this year's conference. So kind of a massive thank you for that, and for kind of sharing and giving us that insight that we could actually use to make this year's conference just a bit more inclusive. So thanks for that. And now I'll jump to Brooke.
Great. Well, thanks, Jason, for organizing this. And I feel sort of humbled, given the other folks on the panel. I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome is sneaking in. However, I'm an associate professor and the interim department chair of communication studies at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. So greetings from Boston. And I am also faculty in the Network Science Institute, which is at Northeastern. My sort of DEI work, honestly, mostly centers on the United States. So my research is on marginalized communities using social media to create change. I focus particularly on race and gender justice, and of late things like the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements. So, as in particular, the events around George Floyd's murder in 2020 unfolded, I got asked to be on a lot of panels and on a lot of committees and so on, because I have a person who's kind of known to at least have done some reading in this space, right? And as I did this, every time I was on one, particularly for a conference, this issue of global equity would come up, right? So in the United States, we're very self-centered and we tend not to think about it. and yet again and again, I kept having people come to me and say, it's really actually harder for a woman to get a visa to come to the US because there's all these awful stereotypes that she's gonna, get pregnant and stay. It's like, well, that's really messed up. Or, it's really an awful lot harder for marginalized folks from South America to get into PhD programs because sometimes you don't even have the exams that are required in your country, right? So how are you even going to get the exams in order to meet the admissions requirements? So my work in global equity really stems from, taking a beat and listening. That of course we have issues with equity and inclusion in the United States, but ours aren't the only issues to tackle. And if we want a really, a full scientific community, we have to tackle them together.
I think that's perfect, Brooke, and thank you for all of the work, and kind of to echo Nisha's kind of claps. Thanks for all the work that you've done, especially for the ICWSM community, and kind of pushing things forward, especially last year, given how difficult last year a year was for kind of everyone around the world. And really happy to see ICWSM stepping up last year and providing scholarships for certain groups of individuals and engaging with other communities and kind of building on that engagement and making it much wider. So that's brilliant, and we'll pick up on a number of those points in a second. So Kokil, it must be quite late in Singapore. We apologize for the timing. How are you doing? Please tell us a bit about you and your work in this space.
Thanks, Jason. I'm doing well. My name is Kokil Jaidka. I'm an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. I've lived and worked in Singapore, in India, in the US, and now I'm back again to Singapore. So I have exposure to multiple cultures, living in a multi-ethnic society, and in my research career, I've very much been a benefactor of some awesome mentors who were inclusive and who were respectful of different cultures, different perspectives. So I do try. I think I'm at the stage right now, being a junior scholar, where it's my turn to start passing on and to learn by example. So I haven't achieved any of the awesome things which other people on this panel have. I'm trying to make small contributions on my own by including students who typically don't have the opportunity to be a part of big research projects, of helping them, mentoring them into their own first author projects, including them when I'm designing a new project, be it a tool for running experiments or a website or even a platform to run a conference on. What I'm trying is to make a difference in empowering them to be actors and not simply not simply facilitators. My own research kind of speaks to these ideas. When I started out, nobody told me that that your work should focus on the US. Fortunately, ICWSM was one of the places where I was able to publish research related to South Asian countries and their social media activity. And I have done some work in the past few years with a bit of a break. And now I'm recentering my focus on Asia, on Singapore, and on India, and the challenges associated with being on social media there. Very excited to be on this panel, and I think I'm going to learn a lot from the awesome people here. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Kokil. And thanks to you for all of your work. So Kokil, for those of you that don't know, is one of the virtual chairs or virtual co-chairs for this year's ICWSM. And Kokil has been quite instrumental actually in trying, as we'll find out a bit later on, but in trying to ensure that this year's conference, because we're virtual, that we kind of reach out to the communities that we don't typically we don't typically engage with as much as maybe we should or we could. So we've done a lot of work there, which Kokil will go on to kind of picking up on later. So thanks everyone for those kind of lovely introductions, and everyone that's out there, you can definitely see that we're going to pull together kind of a star-studded panel for today to really try to get to the root of these issues and what we can actually try to do about them. So I'll probably start back with you, Anisha, in terms of, so the first question is kind of for researchers from less represented regions, what might be some of the challenges to participating in international conferences and international communities?
It's so many things that comes in the way. Usually it's of course the cost of attendance, but I serve on the Gary Marston Student Development Fund that's concentrating on bringing in students or funding students from developing countries to go to conferences, right? But even if we do that, it doesn't even address, we also fund early career researchers. It doesn't even address, trying to get students and researchers from Africa to participate. Because first of all, it's difficult for us to get our papers published. Because it's a lack of capacity building. And I like what Kokil mentioned, and I will contact her afterwards, on mentorship. It's a lack of mentorship. For us, one of the problems is also that the reviewers lack contextual knowledge of our countries, because Africa has many countries. But usually we're treated like the whole of Africa is one country. If you've gone to one place in Eastern Africa, then it's like they feel that that's the whole country or the whole continent that they've been to. So we struggle quite a lot. And actually internationally, I fight quite a lot about reviewers, because I get a lot of sort of reviews that I try to arbitrate, etc. And then also conferences are not really valued across many of the African universities as sort of, your credible sort of conference publishing model. So they still prefer journals. So that, I think, also plays negatively towards us. The other problem is that we have a lot of, our researchers have a lot of teaching load. And so it's very difficult to get away. Now, I want to, and then, of course, memberships, quite often on conferences, memberships are very expensive. And then to come in, you actually need to have memberships and so on. I can talk a little bit later about what we did to overcome some of these. Now we are getting into the virtual conferencing space. And you know what? It is still expensive, because a lot of the conferences still charge a fee, right? So it is still expensive to get in. And even if we get in, I think I've paid for about 2 conferences this year. And I never even set foot on any of the platforms, despite, all of my good intentions, even myself, because, it's like your work is so overburdened that it doesn't even, I think the virtual conferencing also doesn't really allow us to sort of, participate in conferences. There's a whole lot that I can say about, just in general with publishing, not only particularly with conferences, but, Africa is still sort of treated like just grounds for doing data collection, right? And we are not recognized as peers, who can do our own research. So for me, we still remain voiceless in international conferences and confined to special sessions, such as panels, for instance. So, and also I find also that we have, there's still a very blatant disregard for countries and for universities' rules and ethic requirements and our own ethics, sets of ethics that guides our research and our communities. And really, because I'm responsible for research across the university and we have many external collaborations, I really see this, constantly. There's also a lot of stereotyping that is going along, and, and it's almost like you have to perpetuate the stereotypes of Africa to drive publications. But we, the co-researchers are oftentimes left off those publications. And that's why I'm saying that we still remain voiceless, which is probably why we started doing certain initiatives to get our own voices heard. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Anisha. I think you've touched on so many points. You kind of left it a bit difficult for Francisco, maybe, in terms of. I'm not sure if you've left anything else. I'm sure there are more topics to discuss, but I think what you've mentioned, there's a lot of really key, lot of really important points, which are definitely things that kind of are critical, that really need to be followed up on. And I'm definitely keen on kind of pulling the others in later on, but also, of course, looping back around to you to get your input in terms of how do we address some of these issues, because some of them are in some ways quite systemic, actually. And I do think that there needs to be a massive push to address these issues. I mean, even in so earlier this week in Redia Abebe's keynote, she was able to talk actually in length about this point where we see sometimes it's actually easier if you're from the global north to access data based or coming from the global south. Because if you're in the global south, maybe people don't talk to each other, maybe data is expensive. So we're seeing a number of actually dynamics here, which are just completely, crazy when you think about it. So, it's really great to hear you picking up on a number of those points. Francisco, I'll come to you now. Shall I repeat the question, or are you?
No, I think, exactly as you said, Jason, I completely agree with everything Anisha is saying. This, at least in my experience in trying to include Latin America and the Caribbean in historically computer science focused conferences, has been entirely this issue, the difference of priority in terms of publication at conferences versus journals, the financial difficulties of attending something in person, and also just simply the logistic difficulties too. In the past, we've had some initiatives at other conferences, such as in the algorithmic game theory space, such as WINE, where, for example, there are wonderful financial initiatives to allow for individuals to come to the conference, but at the visa level, these are completely thrashed. If the conference is located in the US or somewhere in Europe. And so there is definitely a massive scope for essentially just hosting the conference in different places to help people attend. And I think one thing that everyone's touched upon is that the pandemic has really opened up it's been interesting in that it's on one hand, it's been difficult for us to establish the same collaborations as before, but on the other hand, these virtual venues have really been a massive opportunity for participation from individuals who historically would not have participated in the past. This was our experience with MD4SG last year. This is what we're trying to push for our inaugural ACM conference on equity in access and algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization. And I will say that one of the maybe interesting questions going forward is to maintain some form of hybrid approach for this. I think this is, I think the panel here is actually the perfect group of people to perhaps have a discussion of how might we be able to kind of keep the best of both worlds going forward, because it has really been a wonderful experience to include people who haven't been able to in the past. And I will say so just to not add too much more to what Anisha was mentioning, one other thing that we do see a little bit more in Latin America is that there is also, though not necessarily a hard barrier, also a soft barrier could be language as well. And one of the things that we did last year for MD4SG is that we provided actually simultaneous translation from English to Spanish for plenary talks. And we actually had some of the plenary talks in Spanish by policymakers from the region, and panel discussions in Spanish translated to English. And it's one of those things where, although individuals who participate are able to communicate in English most of the time, simply providing that it's more comfortable. It makes it easier to discuss some of the realities that are on the ground, which also for interdisciplinary communities like us at MD4SG and here at ICWSM is also a very fruitful potential for collaboration and mentorship. I think one of the great things that we've done at MD4SG is actually brought to the fore the problems that stakeholders within the very communities are actually facing that in themselves are very interesting research questions, and simply providing a forum where people can interact, can discuss these problems, and then kind of cause the spark for potential collaboration kind of gets everything started. And then for us, this actually was the spark that we needed to begin a working group in mechanism design for social good on the region, on the Latin American and Caribbean region. And so one thing that we've done is we've had some researchers from the United States, from Europe, people who work in mechanisms matching policymakers, and we're currently working on the Venezuelan refugee crisis and trying to bring in optimization methods in that setting. And again, this is one of these problems that people are aware of this issue in many places around the world, but we're able to bring in this local lens that makes the problem more interesting, because there are many more dimensions to it than one can see at perhaps a superficial level, and also gives this bridge of participation from individuals from the region to the global north. And I think that discussions like this, events like this are the perfect way to begin doing this going forward. And I really do hope that we can find a sweet spot for this in the future.
Yeah, perfect. I think there's so many things that you picked up on there, even tying into yesterday's keynote with Virgilio from Brazil. There's so many points to pick up there, even as he was speaking about the international context, of even thinking about things like digital governance, and then the reality that sometimes people might be trying to just kind of almost take kind of digital governance mechanisms for the US or for Europe or whatever, and just map them to the global south, for instance. And there's really one of the key points that he was trying to mention there is that, the key that completely misses context. It completely misses culture. It completely misses, the realities of on the ground. And I think one of the key things he was trying to emphasize is we do need to ensure, things that, things can't be built for people or built for, generic people anymore. That's not how things, it's much more ground up, and that's how we should be kind of developing things going forward. Thanks for that. Brooke. So I mean, there's so many things that you could pick up on there. I mean, I have a kind of a tailored question for you, but do you prefer to pick up on some of the things that you've heard so far? I'll leave it open to you. Which do you prefer?
I think I could maybe add a little context around what we've done at ICWSM. And it obviously builds on some of these things. So I am, first of all, taking copious notes. So thank you. There are many areas where ICWSM can improve, is the short answer. Historically, I think what we have done is the usual things, right? So we've tried not to do wrong things. So we do things like issue invitation letters, in order to support visas, and issue attendance letters for folks who need that kind of proof in order to travel and so on. We've tried to be mindful, at least, within the kind of global north, like moving the conference around just a little bit, so it might be relatively more accessible. I mean, the non-trivialness of, traveling, it's a big difference if it's in Germany or LA, right? We've also done some interventions with reviewers. So specifically, highlighting that what might be a simple replication is actually quite impactful. If you're studying activism in Baltimore or Hong Kong, doing the exact same study may yield very different results, right? And so that's of interest. So we've tried to make clear that novelty can stem from studying the very same thing in very different contexts. We also did, when I was on the program committee or the program committee chair, we did some specific interventions around reviewers commenting or assuming things about people's fluency. I think that is a kind of insulting way to alienate folks of all different kinds. So we said, it's not our job to be copy editors, right? So that's not what we're asking reviewers to do. If there's something to be flagged, like, sure, people can edit, that's fine, but comment on the science. Then last year, I was one of the program committee co-chairs, and we were suddenly faced with the situation where we had to plan an entirely virtual conference on 3 weeks' notice. And so we did a few things. I'd like to say it was deliberate to try to be more inclusive of the global community, but frankly, we just got lucky. But I think here is where we start to, build some bridges to the kinds of ideas that Anisha and Francisco highlighted. So we did think carefully about timing, just sort of time of day. And I was personally responsible for scheduling all the panels. And I, spent a lot of time trying to think about time zones, although I also had the wherewithal to ask, and we got this really interesting result. We did a survey of all the accepted authors, and I said, when do you want to present? What time of day? And most people said, during the kind of mid-morning, my local time would be great. But the second most common answer was whenever the most people are going to be online. I don't mind getting up in the middle of the night if that means I have a bigger audience. And I thought that was really insightful, that people come to conferences in order to network and make connections. So if people are awake, poor Kokil, right? If people are awake, at 11 a.m. or a convenient time on the East Coast of the United States, then maybe some folks actually would rather present then than in the middle of the night when people might not log on. The last thing that we did, which again was totally serendipitous, I'd like to say we planned it, but we didn't, there were emergent social activities in other languages other than English, which I think was a really lovely thing for folks, as Francisco highlighted, that it's not that people can't communicate in English, but sometimes it's more comfortable, particularly around pop culture and social interaction, to communicate in a language other than English. So some folks took it on themselves, and we supported social interactions in Mandarin and Spanish and Japanese, I think, last year. So those kinds of things, I think can help for the folks who have the resources to actually travel or to participate in some way. To give them some comfortable spaces where maybe the cognitive burden is not quite so high to interaction. Seems like a nice thing moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. I think there's so much there. Even last year, I mean, the reality of having to kind of go virtual at such late notice, but I mean, it's really been interesting because it has meant so many opportunities, and it's kind of baby steps in some ways, because it has meant that people that couldn't travel to Atlanta last year were then all of a sudden potentially able, if they could afford the cost of registration. But I remember also that last year's conference also had a number of free registrations available specifically to Black and marginalized communities that they can actually engage with the conference and the online conference that they might, in such a way that they might not have been able to before. So I mean, actually, that's a really good point, and I think that kind of segues us on very nicely to Kokil, you, and maybe speaking a little bit maybe about what has ICWSM done this year in the context of these topics. Can you give us maybe a little bit of an overview of that, maybe in the context especially of what Anisha and Francisco have been talking about?
Sure. I think in talking about what ICWSM did this year, I'll be talking about the whole organizing committee that has put this together. Definitely not just my efforts, definitely not just my ideas, the ideas of a fabulous EDI team, some of the members who are, of course, facilitating this panel as well. We started a preparation really early in terms of putting out a pre-conference survey to understand some of the same issues that Brooke and the chairs had to do at short notice last time. So we had ample time to prepare. We knew that it could be a virtual or a hybrid conference. So we went in with a pre-conference survey in January to start to collect feedback about what people preferred, when they would like to meet, what tools they preferred, and so on. That gave us a wealth of data, and that showed us how lacking we were in, how desperately we needed outreach efforts, because most of our responses were from the US or from Europe, and we barely had maybe 5 or 6 responses from anywhere else in the world. And this was because we were leveraging on authors from previous years. So despite everything that we're doing in our power to make ICWSM inclusive, there is there seems to be a skew in terms of who's publishing at ICWSM and which countries they are from, unfortunately. So then this arose in us, and especially in Jason, the need to press us to work harder in these areas, in reaching out to these areas. Of course, our EDI chairs were awesome in identifying some things that we hadn't even thought about, such as how much a conference's prestige plays in this part. So that was still the pre-planning stage where we were already starting to think about these issues and identify the gaps. And that's what informed our planning stage. When the accessibility, diversity chairs, inclusivity chairs got involved in helping us craft both a program that was inclusive, identifying issues and topics and themes that were inclusive. They had, I think, an instrumental role in nominating our keynote speakers as well. I recall that. And this was planning during this was the planning stage. Even after that, what we tried was through the process of getting scholarships, of course, and publicizing those scholarships massively, collecting, tapping into all our networks through the steering committee and otherwise to publicize registrations, publicize scholarships, publicize volunteering, publicize any means we could into encouraging more and more first-timers from countries that typically don't attend to attend. I think the results have been really encouraging. If you've attended the opening remarks, then Jason's numbers do suggest that we're going in the right direction. We have literally nearly doubled the number of institutions that have joined ICWSM. I think institutions and first-timers are a good signal that things are going in the right direction. So of course, having a lot of first-timers, like 60% of first-timers is great, but having institutions join us is also really awesome, because if institutions like us, then there are more people. They're the hubs, right? This has been a fascinating lesson, real-life lesson in understanding how inclusivity can be planned from the beginning rather than unfortunately be an afterthought. Definitely something I enjoy being a part of.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kokil. And I do think, we did try our best this year to of course try to kind of reach out to communities, but you're completely right, and to follow up on Brooke's point and to tie into some of the stuff that Anisha you mentioned, Francisco mentioned as well. When we looked at it, when we started sending out numbers to try to figure out, okay, what type of conference are people interested in? And we got the numbers back, it was like 90% of people from the US, and it was like, okay, well, how do we reach out to people from other domains? Okay, who has a contact list from South America or from Africa or from certain parts of Asia? Like, oh, well, I don't. Do you? No, I don't. Do you? So there was clearly it's clearly a gap, and it's clearly an area, and not only, of course, to reaching out, but I think one of the good things we did this year, which is a little step, is to work with our sponsors to basically include free registrations in a number of. So every sponsor basically had supported free registration for at least 5 people from underrepresented groups and regions. And I think that was one of the kind of small steps. But I'll kind of try to advance the discussion. We highlighted a number of problems. I'd like to maybe focus on, I'll kind of jump to you, Anisha, in terms of, how through your effort. So, you've talked a little bit about, and you gave us a hint, you teased us a little bit with solutions earlier on in your presentation. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you've tried to solve these issues in general, or any kind of tips that we might want to consider as a sort of still teenager conference in many ways?
Yeah, there were several different things. When we started AfriCai, there were, of course, lots and lots of things we had to consider. And funny enough, everybody who wanted to give us money just because of the vastness of the continent would be, oh, why don't you guys do virtual events, right? And then you don't consider that, internet connectivity is a problem. Even now when we teach, for instance, we teach online as well, but you will find that we have actually our videos off all the time. And so people kind of like assume that this is now, I don't know, but we're kind of like stereotyped now as the people who keep their video off. But the reason we do that is because of bandwidth issues. But nonetheless, so there was always like this thing. And now we're saying, okay, now you're seeing the whole world is now on virtual. And now people are complaining, but they always wanted us to do that because they didn't want to spend the money. I mentioned also that we had, oftentimes you have problems with paying membership fees, and we found that in the Afrikai community. And Afrikai has essentially all of your African countries in there. Whoever is interested in human-computer interaction, will sort of join. We have a list, a mailing list. We also have and mailing list is still one of the sort of ways to reach our people because they don't have membership fees. So if SIGCHAI wants to reach out or ACM wants to reach out, they won't reach, your African researchers. We also use, the use of social media is quite prolific, right, across Africa. So your Facebook, Twitter is, some countries is like really using it a lot, like Kenya and so on. But then you also see oftentimes that, Twitter is being banned, for whatever reason, oftentimes. So we go through those waves. But for us, like WhatsApp, of course, and then Facebook are sort of very big channels for us. So we advertise on that. We distribute information on that. Very successfully for us are also summer schools, and moving around within Africa. And then you can try the hybrid model of having people interact virtually. I think for us that works pretty well right now, sort of more of the hybrid models and not purely just virtual models. Now, what I've, for instance, done, just because I was a dean, was at my previous university, I actually made available in the budget of the university, I made available some money for paying for memberships. So I would actually fund all of the staff, whoever is interested, for IEEE and for ACM membership. And then we would do the same with students, like we would make it as a prize, for students to get membership. And actually ACM noticed at one stage that Namibia had the largest amount of ACM memberships, but it was actually coming from one point because I was paying for it. Now, one of the problems that we're having is also access. Oftentimes universities have problems with access to the ACM DL, for instance. And some of us are more privileged, generally in Namibia, we're more, and South Africa, we're more privileged, and perhaps in Kenya as well, than other universities elsewhere in Africa, where there wouldn't even be money made available for anything like that. And so oftentimes you have to share with students, and I have to share with students coming from all countries. They would ask me, you would have to share the PDFs, and and sometimes you have to share your DL login. I hope that nobody's listening who would be flagging me on that. And then the whole issue with language. Now, if you would attend any of the African Union conferences or activities or events, you'll notice that we always have translation. But translation services are very, very expensive because trying to bring everyone together means that we're speaking Portuguese, French, English, Arabic, Swahili. I think those are the official languages of the AU. That means that you always have translation services. But with Africa in particular, we had a problem. We didn't use translation services because of the cost. But we had a problem with our North African countries where it was mostly French speaking and then Arabic, but they could all speak French, right? But then, the English was really a barrier. We got some reviewers, who French-speaking reviewers, and we said, okay, you can sort of, put your articles in any language, and we would translate it into English because you know what? On ACMDL, only English is accepted. And so for that, we also, to overcome the problem that Brooke was mentioning, I think about fluency in English, right? So for that one, we also had English grammar revision type of service. So, it's part of your shepherding process that we had instituted. And many of our first-time authors, because we're trying to grow the authorship across Africa, many of them would actually have mentioned to us that, because of the reviewer comments that they got back, and we had very strict reviewer rules, and guidelines, because of the reviewer feedback, that was also very kind-hearted, because it was one of the things that we said, you can tell them what you want to tell them, but be nice about it. Some of the authors would tell us that they got rejected at Africae, but they actually managed to get accepted elsewhere. And so, but we also had a whole shepherding process where we would assign mentors who could work with you in refining your paper. And as I say, the English was one part of it. There are multiple things, I think, with the coming back to funding. So we started giving a lot of scholarships out for students and early career researchers to come to conferences. It helped a little bit, but the visa problems were one of the biggest challenges that we couldn't overcome. So a lot of money would be returned because of that challenge. And it's an ongoing challenge. I had, for instance, talks with, different embassies. We try to engage on those issues. Now, as I think Francisco was saying, now, at least with virtual events, you're overcoming that barrier. So I think that there's a lot more that we can do. But with virtual events, though, the time zone issues is something that is terrible. I had conferences this year that were starting at midnight. And it was just impossible for me to actually, also tally and follow along on those. Let me stop here.
That's brilliant. There's so much stuff there to unpack, and I'm really, really happy to see Brooke taking copious notes, because we'll have a debriefing session at some point after this. But I think there's so many key points that you picked up on there, from funding to access to translation. I think that's actually, on that translation point, I'll actually pull in Francisco here, because I remember when a few weeks ago, I spotted on on Twitter, actually, that I think it was MD4SG, or I can't remember, was tweeting in like so many languages, I couldn't believe it. And I was like, wait, that's a brilliant idea. Like, why do we only tweet in English, ICWSM? Why do we do this? Has no one thought about, like, well, if we only tweet in English, then immediately we're only tailoring that message towards a certain group of individuals. So one thing we tried to do kind of quite quickly, and I'll definitely tell you, we copied it from you. So thank you very much. I'm not going to pretend. We started to think, well, what languages do we know? How can we reach other people? So at that point, I'll actually pull you in, Francisco. Please tell us a bit more about your efforts to try to address some of these issues.
No, I'm glad that you noticed this was last year we did this only for Spanish, but this year what we decided to do is we translated to 6 or 7 languages, not just the call for papers mostly, because this is what we did last year in the first place, but this promotional material on Twitter and also just some image material that we could propagate over WhatsApp as well for different communities around the world. And I will say that this has worked wonderful. This has allowed us to reach certain communities that we that previously wouldn't have necessarily engaged with social media in the traditional forms that we had. But on kind of going back to some of the material that Anisha was talking about, we last year for MD4SG, we did something similar where we had. Since we had put up the call for papers in Spanish, we actually did receive a good amount of submissions that were in Spanish as well. And fortunately, we had some members of the program committee who were bilingual, and we had the capacity to be able to review some of these in Spanish and actually implement in an ad hoc sort of way. I think I really wish that we had been able to talk more then, because this was one of the most positively received aspects of the conference, was the fact that we could have some reviewing process for these papers that were in Spanish. Since MD4SG is interdisciplinary, we had a policy and practice track, And this makes perfect sense for having actually material in Spanish. Lots of NGOs and policymakers and actually some stakeholders from some different communities were presenting some of their work, especially because we also had a problem pitch track where it wasn't necessarily existing work, but a specific problem that needed to be tackled in a community that could have been shown. And at MD4SG, what worked well for us is that we had two modalities of presentation. There was the invited talk, which for EMO is going to be the accepted paper for the proceedings, but there's also the poster track. And the poster track actually was a wonderful place to have the shepherding process. I think, of course, all of this is contingent upon the capacity of the program committee to be able to, because ultimately we only have a limited amount of PC members who might be able to shepherd and have this facilitation process, because it's difficult to find bilingual individuals that are reviewing for all the languages we might get. But for something that's like a poster, this was actually, I think that this makes it actually easier, and it's individuals from Latin America were excited to participate in this modality. They got some recognition from their home institutions for this. And in fact, we saw this in the fact that in the certificate of participation, often we were asked to mention a specific poster as well. And what was wonderful is that since we had a poster, it also came with a short lightning YouTube talk about the poster as well. And this was very easy for us to have in both Spanish and English, because the shepherding process allowed us to bring some of the Spanish material to English. And so now we have that material in Spanish and English. It's on YouTube, and it allows us to use these routes that we've created for future individuals to participate. We can show them some of the material that's been shown in the past, this kind of dual modality. And this has been a very pleasant experience for us. I will also say, kind of jumping around on some of the other points that we talked about before, one big issue has always been access to data, as Anisha mentioned. And one of the things that we found very successful last year was that in addition to providing waivers for fees, which we did by virtue of sponsors, but also actually by virtue, we actually had a system whereby people could register for the conference and donate funds to pay for other people's fees. And actually we found that there were many individuals in the community, some who were participating for the first time, who were giving some money to help other, and then we were able to cover all the people who wanted to have a fee waiver for this. So we were very pleasantly surprised by the kind heart of all the people that were participating. But we also had a data grants as well, where there are top-up services that one can give. And I forget the name of them, especially here specifically, but for multiple individuals, mostly from the African continent, actually, we provided, I think, some 5 GB over a certain couple of days to allow them to actually tune in to the video calls and to at least help in bridging this very real issue that we see. So I guess those are my kind of 2 cents on these things, but I'm very glad to hear about especially this hybrid linguistic modality, and this is one of the things that I think we are very keen at EMO and MD4SG going forward to try to provide this functionality, to have this strong multilingual interaction at the academic level, and I'm very happy to hear that people are thinking about this across the board, and I'm sure that we can improve in this going forward.
Perfect, thanks. I think that from what I'm hearing, one of the key things, especially kind of engaging with you and Anisha on these topics, is this kind of question about language. And it was picked up actually in keynotes, it was picked up in other sessions so far. It's kind of clearly one of the kind of core issues. And once again, compliments to you and the team, especially when I heard about because I wasn't even aware before that you can sign up to basically pay for 5G for others in other countries. And that sounds like such a brilliant idea. And, even that opens our eyes to almost like, completely different kind of reality. Even, going back to some of the points that Anisha was mentioning, and the fact that, but actually, we kind of, the reason you turn off the video is not because I don't want to see you or I don't want you to see me. It's simply because to save bandwidth. It's the reality of the matter, which for some, for example, in the global north, might not actually be an issue at all. So I think those are the kind of key topics that really we need to be discussing more. So somehow we've actually only got 4 minutes left. I'm not really sure how that happened. I mean, we could continue for hours on these topics. But maybe to just wrap up, it would be great if you could, maybe the entire panel could maybe suggest real quick, just suggest maybe one short-term goal or one long-term goal in terms of conferences and kind of increasing reach and engagement. So real short, kind of in out. Maybe let's mix things up a bit. Let's try to catch people off guard, and let's go with Colkill first.
Sure. I want to talk about something that I had wanted to discuss with you, and Virgilio brought it up in the keynote, so now I'm justified in bringing it up. And the idea was to encourage diversity and encourage tracks involving global impact, perhaps, which would encourage submissions in that area without necessarily drastically changing the flavor or the brand of ICWSM. I'm so excited about this idea. I don't even remember anymore if this is relevant to your question, but I hope it is. And yeah, that's me.
It is. Thank you very much. Thanks for mentioning that. I'll jump to Anisha now. So it's kind of maybe one goal in terms of the conference, or just ICWSM, but conferences generally.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'd like to see is that conferences such as this one use much more, people within the networks. Well, I hope I'm part of the network now. And then we can sort of use the snowball method that we find more, and we send it to all of our mailing list and post it on social media, etc. And I think it will get a lot more traction that way. Thank you.
That's perfect. Definitely agree. And thank you for actually helping to support and circulate our messages and kind of encourage people to actually attend the conference this year. And then I'll jump to you, Francisco.
I think many great points have been brought up in this discussion. Thank you so much, Jason, for the invitation. Lots of food for thought. I think that in the short term, I would really like to focus on this, what we mentioned, this hybrid functionality approaches, because I think we're starting to see that in certain places where lockdown is easing up in some places. And we see that, I think definitely more of a bias in the global north and university space, that there's fatigue about virtual events there. And so I'm worried that there might be a divide between the access that we provide in virtual events versus the fatigue that individuals who usually benefit from in-person events have. And in the short term, I actually see it as it's very important to think about how to bridge that so that this doesn't become a long-standing divide, because then we would lose out on because I think we were all on equal footing at the beginning, and this was wonderful. And then we need to find out some way of keeping that form of engagement, be it by having, by potentially having regional events linked by having with some virtual links in this. I actually don't really have any potential solutions for this, but I think that my short-term goal is to, now that we're easing up, try to see how to mitigate this. And in the long term, I think focusing just simply more of these systemic ways of including people from different regions around the world. And I think linguistic barriers is a huge one, and it's an easy initial way to tackle just bridging that communication and bringing in what everyone here has mentioned, actually, these longstanding mentorship and just deep connections that can lead to collaborations.
Perfect, thanks. And Brooke, run this out in the panel. What do you think? What's your kind of what's your vision for what we can do?
Great. Well, my vision has certainly expanded in the last hour. So thank you all for your amazing suggestions that I've written down as quickly as I could. So I think building on Francisco's idea, and actually really everyone's idea, I think we have this unique opportunity where, we are scholars of communication technology, and now we are, all power users of this kind of technology if we weren't before. So thinking in the very short term about establishing regional hubs where folks kind of physically gather in different places, and maybe we augment their internet speeds as needed, but can call into the quote unquote main conference. And then in the long term, it would be lovely to think about how we rotate what the main conference is. So actually it's just a network, and there is no one main site. So that just hops around. And I selfishly would love to visit Namibia or Singapore or somewhere else down the line when that's safe for everyone to do.
Thanks, Brooke. So thanks really for those of you joining in. A massive thanks to the panelists. Thank you, Anisha. Thank you, Kokil. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Brooke. And I'd also want to say a special thanks to Panos and to Darko, who've been the kind of global equity chairs, but also even to the entire kind of DEI committee this year. There's been so much efforts, but as you can see based on the panel, there's lots more that we can do for the conference. And really this kind of, again, we've kind of sort of charted a path, and we kind of have to kind of continue along this path to ensure that we're not just kind of speaking about DEI and inclusivity and global equity and these kind of things, but we're actually actively putting things in place to make, and this is a systemic thing. It's not something that tomorrow we're going to wake up and solve. It might not be something that we can wake up and solve in the next 5 years, but it's something that as we gradually make steps, that will kind of, these steps will eventually kind of lead to hopefully, a big impact in what's going on in the ICWSM community, but even in kind of work communities wider. So once again, thanks everyone for joining in. Massive thanks to the panelists. Take care, and I will see you all later.